This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, I think that is fixed. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. I am Caitlin Coleman. I'm Water Education Colorado's Publications and Digital Resources Managing Editor, and I'm really excited to present our webinar today, which is called Colorado's New Program to Protect Aquatic Ecosystems from the Impacts of Dredge and Fill Activities. We have two great panelists who are both from the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and I know that many of you participating also have familiarity with the program and lots of questions to ask. Before we get started, just a note, if you didn't hear me earlier, to remain muted during our presentations, and then we'll allow some 15 minutes or so for Q&A at the end of our time together, and then you can unmute yourself or type questions into the chat at that point. If you want to communicate during the presentations, you can use the chat and we'll either circle back to those questions during Q&A or perhaps answer them as we go along. And of course, the webinar is being recorded. I'll aim to send out a recording in the next week, hopefully by the end of this week. If you're new to Water Education Colorado, our nonprofit works to ensure that Coloradans are informed on water issues and equipped to make decisions that guide our state to a sustainable water future. We are a non-advocacy organization committed to providing educational opportunities and engaging Coloradans around water. We do this in a variety of ways. We have leadership programs, educational programs like this webinar, also water news coverage and publications. So you can visit our website and learn more and become a member if you aren't already. The webinar was free to anyone who's a member. And since if you're interested in our webinars in general, we have a few in the works, but one scheduled for July 9th with the Colorado Water Trust. So mark your calendar, save the date, and join us July 9th. That one is going to be focused on why is there water in one river and not another. So it should be interesting to learn more about that later this summer. But for today, as soon as Colorado's new Dredge and Fill program started coming online, we reached out to the Water Quality Control Division to see if we could put something together and learn more. And so that's what we're doing here today. We'll hear from Kelly Morgan, the manager of Clean Water Compliance and Enforcement Section at CDPHA's Water Quality Control Division, and from Annette Quill, the Senior Policy Advisor at the Water Quality Control Division. So with that, I will pass it over to Kelly and Annette and get your slides started. Let's see.
First of all, I just need to hear if folks can hear me. Do I have feedback?
You do.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
Maybe would it be better to just use the microphone on your computer and mute your phone? I can mute you there if that's better.
Yeah.
Okay. You want to try again, Annette? I can't hear you now.
How is that?
Still feedback. Maybe we try the other direction. If you're able to unmute your phone.
I was doing that before. I'm sorry, everybody. I'm having technical difficulties. I may just have to do this without being on video. I can't.
I think you're sounding okay. I think you're sounding okay. We can let you know if it starts to feel really echoey. It seems better.
All right. My apologies.
Let me get your slides started for you. Is that showing up?
Yes.
Okay, let's try it and see how you're sounding.
Okay. I'm echoing on my end, but if I can try to ignore that, I will. Let's see. Okay. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Again, I'm sorry that I'm having some difficulties, but I'll try to muddle through this. I'm happy to be here today to provide an overview with Kelly of Colorado's groundbreaking dredge and fill program. And we can just go to the overview. Next slide. So this is just a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today. I'm going to first go over what dredge and fill actually is for those of you who might not be familiar, and why it's important to regulate dredge and fill activities. Then I'll talk about the scope of state waters that are protected by the program. I will then go through some of our main exemptions and exclusions. And then I'm going to hand it over to Kelly to discuss the current status of our implementation efforts. And then she'll discuss our permitting program, which is what we call authorizations, beginning with what we call temporary authorizations, and then the isolated state waters general authorization and the various general authorizations, which correspond with the Corps' nationwide permits and regional general permits. Then I'll come back and discuss individual authorizations. And finally, Kelly will cover the last two topics regarding our enforcement and compliance assistance efforts and fees for the program. Okay, next, please. So what is dredge and fill activity for those of you who may not know? If you can go on to the next slide, thank you. So dredging is, just kind of what it sounds like. It's excavating materials for different purposes from waterways to either restore waterways or deepen them, to develop infrastructure, or for environmental cleanup. Fill is, filling in waterways and wetlands with materials mostly for construction or development purposes. And this is important. This program is important to regulate these types of activities because we're aiming to balance water protection with necessary development and infrastructure improvement. We're trying to protect Colorado's waters, and kind of finding a balance between those two really important elements of protection and development. The program focuses on a clear hierarchy, which is based on what the federal program does, which is avoiding impacts first, then minimizing those impacts wherever possible, and finally, where the last step is mitigating any unavoidable impacts from dredge and fill activities. And why this matters is that healthy wetlands and riparian systems provide critical ecological functions such as water filtration and improved water quality, flood control, erosion prevention, and maintaining a healthy habitat for fish and wildlife. Once these are lost, these systems are extremely difficult and costly to restore and replace. And that's why that hierarchy is important of avoidance, minimization, and then compensation. And so why we regulate these activities, it's crucial for protection of our aquatic ecosystems, starting from wetlands and our headwaters and, smaller ephemeral tributaries all the way down to our perennial streams. So without this oversight, dredging can cause long-term impacts that are just really, really difficult to get back. Next slide. So this photo shows a project that has both dredge and fill activities. You'll notice the equipment, the heavy equipment in the background. that dredged material from the, what was a wetland, as you can see on the right. It's dredging from that wetland, and on the left side of the photo, you can see where the wetland was filled to build a road. And so again, as this demonstrates, this destroys essential habitat features like gravel beds, woody debris, and aquatic vegetation. And also, as you can see, it disturbs sediment, which releases pollutants back into the waterways, and disrupts the food chain. And it can alter that natural riverbed structure, increasing erosion and sediment buildup, leading to higher long-term maintenance needs. And so with this program, we're seeking to minimize those impacts wherever possible. Next slide. So this slide we've used quite a bit, and it depicts what we're trying to protect here in Colorado, the scope of protection of the program. And a lot of you may know of the second, I'm sure most of you, if you're interested in protecting our waters, you're familiar with the Sackett v. EPA decision, which came down in May of 2023. That decision drastically narrowed the scope of federal protection over waters nationwide. And in Colorado, we the place where this impacts us the most is in terms of dredge and fill and the 404, the federal 404 program. Colorado has historically relied on the Corps, the Army Corps of Engineers, to administer a dredge and fill program for the state of Colorado. And in the wake of that decision, and I'll explain these circles in a little more detail, but in the wake of that decision, that protection drastically decreased. So you can see from this first circle, the definition of state waters, which has been in place in Colorado since 1966, is extremely broad. It's everything, and even ephemeral streams, any and all surface and subsurface waters, and also including wetlands, even isolated wetlands. So it's a very broad scope of what the state would intend to protect. Whereas the second slide shows before the second decision, that yellow, the gold interlay, is what the federal Clean Water Act protected prior to Sackett. And so it was perennial streams, intermittent streams, some ephemeral streams, and wetlands that had a significant nexus to, to an otherwise federally jurisdictional water. So that shows, it pretty much, it was almost as expansive as our definition of state waters. So we were pleased with the amount of protection that we were getting from the federal program, and very heavily relied on the Corps, like I said, to regulate those, to regulate dredge and fill activities. But then when the Sackett decision narrowed that definition, as you can see in the third circle, to only protect relatively permanent waters and wetlands with a continuous surface connection to those waters. And so you can see that protection, that amount of protection shrunk, and left everything that's in blue unprotected from the impacts of dredge and fill activities. And now with the definition, the newly proposed definition of waters of the United States by EPA and the Corps, that will even shrink farther because of the way that they are proposing to define relatively permanent waters and that continuous surface connection element with respect to wetlands. So that last yellow circle would shrink even more, which makes our program, which will protect everything that's in blue, will make that even more important. Next slide. So even though our program is really incredibly broad with respect to our definition of state waters and what our program regulates, for purposes of our dredge and fill program, we have a number of exemptions and exclusions that kind of, narrow that world a bit. And those exemptions and exclusions are all in statute. House Bill 241379 is our bill from the legislative session in 2024 that authorized this program and set up the framework for it. And it was really important for the stakeholders in that process that all the exemptions and exclusions be included in statute, and that the Water Quality Control Commission couldn't do anything, through a rulemaking to narrow or expand those exclusions and exemptions. So all that detail is in the statute, and some clarifications are in Regulation 87. But again, they can't narrow or broaden those exemptions or exclusions. Next slide. So exemptions are for types of activities. And this means that activities that are listed as one of our 14 exemptions, they're types of activities that aren't subject to program requirements, no matter what type of water feature they're impacting. So we started with exemptions that were derived from Section 404, 404F of the Clean Water Act. And here's just, a few of those examples that a lot of folks are already familiar with by virtue of them being used for so long in the federal permitting program. And it's a lot of maintenance activities for structures that are already in place, such as dikes and dams and levees, lagoons, transportation structures, such as bridge abutments, that kind of thing. Normal farming and ranching activities, we retain that exemption for purposes of our program. The ag exemptions are pretty broad federally, and I would say even broader in our state program. And finally, also related to ag activities would be construction and maintenance of agriculture, like farm ponds, stock ponds, and irrigation ditches. So those are maintained and very, very detailed in the statute and in Regulation 87 through a lot of description and definitions of terms that are used in those exemptions. And then just a couple of examples of exemptions that are specific to Colorado's program that don't exist at the federal level. We do not cover any activities for which a 404 permit has been obtained or coverage under a 404 permit has been obtained. So we are not attempting to regulate waters of the United States and activities that impact those. So if you have a Corps of Engineers permit, then you're exempt from our program. There wouldn't be dual regulation in that case. And also there's a grandfathering provision that if you had a prior HAD from the Corps that says that your program does not need a Corps permit, we're not regulating those activities either. Another example, preventative mitigation and restoration, emergency response activities after natural disasters. The Corps of Engineers actually has a nationwide permit that it uses for these activities, but we have exempted those activities so long as they utilize certain BMPs and are careful, in the way that they conduct those activities. And finally, another example, again, there's 14 of these in all, but just another example of a Colorado specific exemption is for voluntary ephemeral stream restoration projects. And that, again, was deemed appropriate by our legislature, and the legislature asked the Water Quality Control Commission to kind of come up with guardrails for that exemption, which it did in the Regulation 87 process. Next slide. And now on to excluded types of water features. These exclusions, again, there are 11 total, again, mostly borrowed from the federal exclusions from WOTUS, from the definition of WOTUS. These are, they cover any type of activity, but it's the water feature that is important here. So these types of water features that are excluded, if you're filling them in, doing any kind of work on them, you don't need an authorization from us. So examples that were derived from the federal regulations, these are all man-made features that are created in upland. Ditches and canals that are, an upland is dry land. So it's not a wetland. It's not any kind of state water that's involved. It's, it's ditches and canals that were actually created in dry land. And by virtue of that, they, any maintenance activities, anything that you would be doing in those ditches and canals would not need an authorization. They're excluded. Artificial lakes, lagoons, ponds that are created in upland for stock watering or irrigation purposes, artificially irrigated areas that would revert to upland, and then prior converted cropland. Those are two exclusions that were borrowed from the federal program that we also have. We have a much more detailed definition of what prior converted cropland is that is actually in our statute and in our regulation. And so those are excluded features. And then finally, swales and erosional features that don't exhibit an ordinary high water mark. Those are excluded as well. And then one example of an exclusion that is specific to Colorado's program, which interestingly, for any of you who were involved in the Regulation 87 rulemaking or happen to be listening in, this was one of the more contested issues in the rulemaking hearing. This is for wetlands that are adjacent to a ditch or canal that are supported by the water in that ditch or canal. The commission opted to define those terms adjacent to and supported by in Regulation 87 because it became clear that there was a lot of confusion and different interpretations of those terms by different parties. So the commission opted to define those terms. And, essentially it is intended to be an exclusion for, wetlands that would not be there but for the water flowing through the ditch or canal. And if that ditch or canal, dried up, the wetlands would as well. So that's what that exclusion is all about. Next slide. Okay, so now I'll hand it over to Kelly to talk about the current status of the program and the implementation efforts.
Thanks, Annette. As Annette and Caitlin mentioned, my name is Kelly Morgan and I manage our compliance and enforcement section in the Clean Water Program, and our dredge and fill protection unit is part of our section. So I'm going to talk today about the current status of program implementation and some other things that we're doing as far as carrying out the directives of the legislation and the regulation. So we can go to the next slide. So this slide depicts kind of a general timeline as when it comes to project implementation. In February 2026, we issued the Isolated State Waters General Authorization, which I'll get into in a moment. In March, Regulation 87 became effective, which allows us to now issue individual authorizations, develop Colorado-specific general conditions, and also move forward with public noticing all of our other general authorizations for comment. And you'll notice here, April and May, what we decided to do was to issue our general authorizations for public comment in 2 batches. These general authorizations generally follow the federal framework for nationwide and regional permits. We also developed our own Colorado general conditions, which we noticed in that first batch. The second batch is available for public comment currently, and that period will expire June 1st. So you will have the opportunity to comment if you're interested, and all of the documents are located on our website, along with an opportunity to comment. Next slide, please. So per the regulation and the legislation, the state has until September 1st, 2026 to make our general authorizations effective. Right now we're issuing temporary authorizations, but beginning September 1st, that temporary authorization program will be replaced with general authorizations. And just a note here, when it comes to comments, we will be posting all of the comments we receive on our general authorizations, as well as our division responses to those comments once they're available. Next slide, please. So now I'll move into temporary authorizations, which I just kind of hit on briefly. You can go ahead and move to the next slide, Caitlin. All right, so temporary authorizations, which we also call TAs, are designed to serve as an interim solution while the state transitions to a more permanent authorization program. These temporary authorizations allow projects to continue moving forward until our general authorizations are fully in place in September. So as of January 1st, 2025, anyone seeking authorization to discharge dredge or fill material into state waters that aren't federally regulated must apply for a TA through the division. One thing to note here is that a temporary authorization is not always required. So for example, projects that are in waters of the United States or isolated state waters are not eligible, or they aren't required to obtain a temporary authorization. If the relevant nationwide or regional general permit that you would operate under does not require pre-construction notification, you may not need a temporary authorization. But if a project does require pre-construction notification under the relevant nationwide or RGP, or if compensatory mitigation is required, then a TA is required. If you have questions about whether or not a TA is required for your project, we have a decision tree that's available on our website, and we'll link to our website at the end of this presentation. Another thing to note here is that temporary authorizations recognize nationwide and regional general permits issued by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers as valid, which kind of helps streamline the process and will be a little bit familiar to practitioners who are used to working under the federal framework. Overall, these temporary authorizations provided a bridge for us to ensure continuity in the program and for projects while we're maintaining regulatory oversight and further developing our program. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we also developed an isolated state waters general authorization that became effective earlier in February of 2026. We can move to the next slide, and I'll hit briefly on what that means. So the Isolated State Waters General Authorization, or what we're calling the ISWGA, was specifically called for in the House bill that we must create this Isolated State Waters General Authorization. And, the fact that it was in the legislation underscores its importance importance and the role that it plays in guiding our work. A copy of the authorization can be found on our website for your review and reference. So I encourage you to take some time to review it and familiarize yourself with this contents as it serves as a framework in our efforts moving forward. One thing to note here is that the Isolated State Waters General Authorization is a non-notifying authorization. So you can operate under that authorization without notifying the division. However, we are requesting that project proponents and those who undertake projects under this authorization notify us of the project completion once your project is complete, just for tracking purposes and reporting back to the legislature. Next slide, please. So next we'll move into general authorizations. As I mentioned earlier, these will take effect starting in September 26 and are largely based on conditions that are similar to federal nationwide permits. This structure is intended to provide continuity for project proponents that are familiar with the federal process. As I mentioned earlier, batch 2 of our general authorizations is currently out for public comment. Next slide, please. And as you'll see here, and as we mentioned previously, that by no later than September 1st, the division will issue its own general authorizations, and these will be for specific categories of dredge and fill activities, again, that align with the federal permitting framework. This September deadline marks a really significant step forward in creating a more streamlined and predictable permitting process through the state. And the general authorizations will replace the temporary authorizations, again, which provides a little bit more consistent framework for applicants. Again, these authorizations are aligned with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers nationwide and regional general permits. This alignment ensures that our state processes remain consistent with the federal framework while still allowing for some state flexibility. So at the same time, in September 2026, the division will issue the Colorado General Conditions document, and these better reflect Colorado's unique environmental conditions and regulatory needs. And so that'll be a standalone document that works in conjunction with the general authorizations that you would qualify for. Next slide, please. And with that, I will kick it back over to Annette.
Thanks, Caitlin. Okay. All right. Well, individual authorizations are our counterpart to the Federal Corps of Engineers individual permits, and therefore they will be used for larger projects with greater impacts. So far, we were able to start receiving applications for individual authorizations when the regulation 87 went into effect at the end of March, and we've received one application thus far. So these will not be used nearly as much as our general authorization. Next slide, please. So again, these will be utilized for larger projects that don't fall under the scope of either a temporary authorization or, once they're issued in September, a general authorization. And the regulation says that individual authorizations are required for activities that result in permanent loss of state waters of the trigger is 0.5 acres of wetlands. That would be, so anything above that threshold would generally need an individual authorization. And then the second category of when individual authorization might be needed is that on a case-by-case basis, where the division, if we receive an application for coverage under a general authorization, and in the division's review of that application, it determines that the project will result in more than minimal individual or cumulative adverse impacts, then the division has the discretion to require individual authorization in that case. And as I mentioned, we're now able to accept applications for individual authorization. And I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. So in the legislation itself, House Bill 241379, the commission is given the responsibility to adopt rules for individual authorization, and they're pretty detailed rules. There is a very there's a pretty beefy section on application requirements, and very detailed, just to be transparent and make sure that folks know what's necessary with respect to applications. And a big part of applications for individual authorizations are that we incorporated kind of a mini NEPA process where, and I say mini because I don't think most of our projects will be as as involved as some of the federal projects that you see that involve perennial waters. But that's yet to be determined. But and we'll have to kind of work through the details of this as we go. But just some examples, under the National Environmental Policy Act, a purpose and need statement is needed. It's necessary for your project, so we're going to require that as well. An alternatives analysis to make it clear that you, as the project proponent, have considered other alternatives that are less damaging to the environment. And then finally, a LEDPA, or a least environmentally damaging practicable alternative requirement, where the division can only grant an authorization for the LEDPA, for the project that is the actual least environmentally damaging alternative. So those are some of the detailed requirements, but Regulation 87.6 has them in detail. Another category of requirements is for water quality protection, and that's akin to 401 certification requirements, which the division does for 404 permits. So again, they're more for downstream, in-stream and downstream water protection, where the project actually occurs, and upstream and downstream of the project. And then finally, they're monitoring, record keeping, and reporting requirements that are required by regulation, but that'll be more tailored to each project in the individual authorization itself. Finally, just a note that restoration, stream restoration type projects will commonly be covered under a general authorization, not an individual authorization, for those of you here who may be interested in that. Next slide. I think I'm handing back to Kelly at this point.
Thanks, Annette. All right. So lastly, we'd like to discuss compliance, and then we'll get into fees at the end of the presentation. But compliance is a critical component of any regulatory program, and while our primary push right now is to ensure projects are properly authorized, and we are processing applications in a timely manner, our responsibilities with program implementation go beyond authorizing projects. So we are able to provide compliance assistance, and we will be conducting oversight and enforcement activities to ensure projects comply with the authorization and the law. And so we can move to the next slide. And I wanted to touch briefly on how we support and ensure compliance under the program. So first, we do offer a significant amount of compliance assistance, especially early on in program implementation. We know a lot of folks have questions. So we do have guidance materials available on our website. We'll continue updating those resources with new information over time. And then in addition, our team is available to answer general questions. We'll also offer up to 2 hours of free consultation for project-specific questions, and that would include help with determining whether an exemption or exclusion applies to your project. We can also provide guidance on authorization terms and conditions to ensure that there's a common understanding of what our expectations are when it comes to compliance. And then second, our compliance oversight activities will include staff conducting routine inspections to ensure that projects are meeting requirements. We have a small staff in the Dredge and Fill Protection Unit, but we also have a dedicated compliance unit that inspects construction sites for stormwater compliance. And that team is being trained to recognize dredge and fill activities in the field. So if they observe something relevant, then they'll refer that matter to the Dredge and Fill unit for follow-up. And then finally, with regards to enforcement, enforcement is a formal mechanism used in more serious situations, particularly when there's a significant risk to public health or the environment. And enforcement actions, as with any compliance activity, are intended to compel compliance, and they may include penalties when necessary. So together, these efforts are designed to provide support, ensure accountability, and protect Colorado's water resources. So we can go to the next slide. And so finally, I wanted to briefly address how this program is funded. The legislation that Annette referred to earlier establishes a funding structure that combines both general funds and cash funds. And so as part of that structure, it's necessary for the division to collect fees to ensure the program can operate effectively and sustainably. These fees help support staff, resources, and the oversight needed to implement the program, again, to protect our water resources over the long term. So we can go to the next slide, and I'll talk briefly about how this fee structure was developed. So these fees, when we were working on our proposal for the commission, we used the best available data that the division had during the rulemaking and leading up to the rulemaking, and that included the number of projects that applied for coverage under our Clean Water Policy 17, which is the very preliminary way that the division addressed dredge and fill activities, as well as the number of applications we received for temporary authorizations. We also relied on some information from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So that said, we recognize that this is an evolving program, and we've built in a commitment to revisit the fee structure in 2 years. So as we gain more real world data and see how many projects are coming through the system, these fees may be adjusted to better reflect actual program needs. You'll notice here that the temporary and general authorizations require a fee. That fee is per project, and then it also includes an annual fee as well. Those fees are due upon application. As I mentioned earlier, the division will provide 2 hours of consultation services at no charge, but then anything beyond that, that really gets into project specifics. There will be a fee for service. Individual authorizations are also charged on an hourly basis, and they have an annual fee. Restoration projects have a small fee, and this was based on a lot of the stakeholder feedback that we received while we were conducting that stakeholder process. So we can move into the next slide. So as I mentioned, with these fees, they're an annual kind of recurring fee, but those fees can be stopped once we issue a certification of project completion. So when your project is complete, you'll submit a written request for the certification, which will likely be a digital form on our webpage. And then these requests will be granted when you can demonstrate that the discharge or the activity has been completed, impacts have been restored, and all conditions in the authorization, including compensatory mitigation, are satisfied. And then we can go to the last slide, which kind of wraps everything up. So we're happy to answer any questions you may have at this time. And we also want to encourage folks to visit our website that was recently updated and contains a wealth of information that could be helpful for you in navigating the program.
Great. Thanks, Kelly, and thank you, Annette. So stop sharing slides, and if folks have questions, you can type them into the chat or raise your hand or just turn on your camera and speak up. So I see a first question coming in. Will the state honor previous core findings of no jurisdictional wetlands?
I can take that one. Yes, we are. Anything that the Corps issued, any official determination that it issued prior to the Sackett decision, so that's end of May of 2023. We will be honoring those. That's one of the exemptions that is clearly in the statute as well as regulation.
And then can you clarify if the project occurs within WOTUS that requires a PCN, will notification to the state under a TA or GA also be required?
No. So if the Corps determines that the water feature in question is waters of the United States, then you don't need to apply for dual coverage under the state. However, if the project covers an area where the Corps determines part of the project area is waters of the United States, but the other part is state waters, then you would have to come through the state to get a general authorization.
And then someone else asked, do you know or anticipate whether mitigation bank design and build requirements will be the same as 404?
So we are allowing folks to use mitigation banks for mitigation, but currently the division doesn't have a program to necessarily authorize a mitigation bank. So you could use one that's already established. Hopefully that helps. Question.
Yeah, I will add, we are definitely open to establishing new mitigation banks here in Colorado. And I would think that our requirements would be the same as the federal requirements because again, this program is very heavily modeled after the federal. So as those move forward, I think it's safe to assume that they would be the same requirements as the federal generally.
Does anyone else have questions or follow-ups?
I have one. Thank you for the presentation. Have any other Western states have implemented or are working on dredge and fill regulations that you know of?
I can take that. It's interesting you asked that question. I was just out at a conference for the National Association of Wetland Managers out in West Virginia, and I was on a panel with representatives from New Mexico and Washington, who are both right in the middle of establishing their own dredge and fill programs for their state to fill in that gap created by Sackett. So those are the two that I know of. And I hope that others will follow, but those are the two I know of offhand.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else? Any other questions? How are you guys feeling about how things are going? You're in the middle of it.
Really good, actually. We have a great team that has been able to, meet all of the deadlines that we're required to meet. We've been, processing the temporary authorizations within our time control goals, and we are also conducting compliance oversight and providing a significant amount of compliance assistance. So I think, with the rulemaking being wrapped up, it really jump-started the program. And so I think we're quite happy about where we're at now. And I think it's really important for us and for others to get the word out that the program exists, and that if anybody has questions, we're happy to provide some assistance.
And I'll just add, I see there's another question, but Kelly already mentioned the division's Dredge and Fill website. I think it's a great resource, and I think it's it was set up well, very intuitive, so you can find a lot of really good information there if you're interested in learning more.
And the only other question we have right now, is there a fee associated with a determination of regulated state water?
Our guidance with questions of whether or not a water feature is a state water is to first consult with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and have them make a determination. Their determination might not necessarily mean that you're exempted or excluded from our program, because as Annette mentioned earlier, some of Colorado's exemptions and exclusions differ from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. But that's a long-term goal for the state to do some mapping of state waters. But to answer your question more directly, no, there is not a fee. But if you had a question about a determination that the Corps made, that would constitute consultation. But again, you have that 2-hour time frame for free consultation services.
And I understand, Kelly, that the division is going to have a form, kind of a form that you fill out if you're requesting an official determination from the state. There'll be a link on the website if there's not already.
Yeah, thank you, Annette.
Mm.
Yeah, do you mind if I just follow up on that?
Pardon?
You mind if I just follow up on that?
Not at all.
Oh, so I guess it's required that we have an approved from the board first?
No. The process is actually described in the regulation. It's in 87.3 subsection 7. And in simple terms, if you think something, this is no different than it would have been before. If you have a question as to whether something is a WOTUS or not, you would go to the Corps. And if they say, no, it's not jurisdictional, you don't need an official HAD. It's my understanding, at least in our districts, here in Colorado, that I don't know, sometimes they do kind of more informal determinations. And if you have something in writing from the Corps, you never have to come to the state, but I would say the safest way to go about it is if you get a determination from the Corps that something is not a WOTUS, you should assume that you need to come to the state for coverage. The only thing is if your project meets one of the exemptions, or if you're in an excluded water body. But that's when you would come to the state to make that determination, unless you're sure yourself that one of those exemptions or exclusions applies. You don't have to come for an official determination. It just provides more more comfort or more, an official determination might be better in certain cases.
And I guess like that could be when the project release.
I'm sorry, your sound isn't coming through very well.
Yeah, I don't know why. I-
Okay, here we go.
Yes.
Um, so I guess that could be in the pre-project review, like that couple of hours. Like I'm thinking of like, somewhere where like an irrigation ditch has been built, and it has wetlands along the edge of it that extend out a little bit, but it's like in the San Luis Valley where that whole valley or a lot of that valley used to be wetlands.
Mm-hmm.
Or like some weird case like that. Like, could that be handled, just in that project review?
Yeah, I think, and I can let Kelly speak to this too, but I think that's a really good example of when, it might be, it'd be good for you to come to the state to see if that meets that wetlands adjacent to the ditch exemption or not. And so again, there would be a form online where you could start and, upload photos, and your own, consultant, your own determination, and just ask for confirmation of what you're thinking. And Kelly, if you want to add anything,
Okay.
and so those first 2 hours, of the division reviewing that, request for an official determination, there would be no charge for that. So if it's pretty straightforward, there would be no charge.
Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have one other question in the comments. Will there be any specific guidance regarding ephemeral features?
Mark, would you mind kind of expanding on that? Is this kind of related to the state waters type of question?
Are you talking? I think I might have an idea, but Mark,
Sure.
I'll let you clarify if you'd like.
Sure. Yeah. Well, down here in the Arkansas Basin, the Fountain Creek watershed, we have a lot of stream channels that are ephemeral, right? And so not present with water, conveying water, have water in them most of the time. And so it raises the question of which of those features qualify as state waters that would be subject to the authorization requirement. And that's where I think there's going to be a lot of question, identification of ordinary high water mark, some of those aspects. And I think unpacking that a little bit more would be super helpful for the regulated community. So we have a kind of common understanding of generally that type of feature is outside, that type of feature is covered. And I was thinking if that type of guidance is developed, that would be very helpful.
And one thing I'll mention on that's what I was thinking, Mark, that the ordinary high water mark is definitely the way we would define an ephemeral feature if it has an ordinary high water mark, but it may not, there are, it may be delineated through vegetation or other means, that are more specific to more arid areas. There are documents that are actually linked, that are mentioned in the regulation itself, as you might know, since I think you were pretty involved in the rulemaking. We have those as a starting point. They are federal documents that help with delineation of features in arid parts of the country. But I'll let Kelly explain if we're going to be having more. I'm sure we are, but go ahead, Kelly.
We will be having more guidance, and that will be coming out kind of over the period of the next year or so. So right now, our primary focus has been getting the general authorizations developed. But yes, Mark, there will be a lot of guidance documents. We're also, working with some outside consultants to assist with that effort. So we'll be continuously updating our website with that type of guidance.
Perfect. Thank you guys. I really appreciate it. And if there's any opportunity to, I guess, provide input or understand how you go or developing those further guidance, that would be very helpful as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. We are
Oh.
at time. I see another question. I don't know if there's a quick answer to this one, but I'll read it out and you guys can decide. If an ephemeral channel lacks a continuous OHWM, will it be considered a WOS?
That's a great question, and I think this would be an example of a question that you could request from our dredge and fill team, because they would be able to get a better sense of kind of like the project specific or the water feature that you're thinking about doing the activity in. So I would just recommend contacting us for that type of question.
Yeah, there will be some of these that are definitely case by case.
Okay. Well, thank you, Annette and Kelly. Thanks to everyone who's here and asked questions and joined to learn. If you hopped on late, we'll be sending out a recording of the webinar, hopefully later this week. And Kelly and Annette, we had a request to share your slides as well. So if you guys are okay with that, we can send those out.
Sure. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, so thanks everyone. Have a great afternoon. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.